Empathy, or its absence, as stress. Empathy without clarity is useless. Clarity without empathy is inhuman. As I have studied and thought deeply about the ideas, diagnoses, and proposals from certain thinkers, contemplating further what their work represents and who it appeals to, I'm struck with the dilemma of not being able to properly define them in a simple label. My instinct is to use idealist and realist. However, since these are societal philosophers and the definitions of philosophical realism and idealism are dramatically different from the standard definitions of idealism and realism, this can cause confusion. Additionally, the realists in the scenario I detail below are not perfect realists, as they deny certain human emotions such as empathy. Many would label the idealists as philosophers from the left and the realists as philosophers from the right. However, I fundamentally disagree in some instances. And labeling them as such will lead to confusion, misunderstanding, and heightened emotions. For clarity, those political and societal philosophers associated with the right often share little to nothing in common with the politicians and political commentators on the right. Likewise, many on the far left act and behave in ways antithetical to the empathy-driven narrative of the philosophical left. Humanism and anti-humanism have been proposed by one of my editors, and they almost fit. However, I believe they do not fully encompass the extremes in which these opposite schools of thought exist, nor do they properly detail the problems with each school of philosophy. For instance, humanism posits that we are able to live our lives with moral and ethical guidance and to choose rationality over mysticism. Anti-humanistic thinkers argue that we are animalistic and driven by our base desires. Depending on one's definition of morality and ethics, as well as reason, both diametrically opposed schools of thought could be interpreted as either humanistic or anti-humanistic. As such, the use of these definitions would likewise stir debates and lead to confusion. In short, one side builds their vision of society based on an impossible ideal of unfettered empathy, naively believing that human beings can shed their base desires and selfish nature. Meanwhile, the other side builds what they believe to be pragmatic societies that account for the worst of humanity. In doing so, they ignore our compassionate side, disregarding the fact that a large percentage of people will reject cold logic, being driven by the overwhelming empathy these supposed pragmatic thinkers mock. Humans are highly emotional, and our range of emotions capture both empathy and callousness. Neither can be ignored, and neither can be eradicated through education or societal pressures. To be truly empathetic, we must accept the worst of what we are and pragmatically design around this. And to be truly pragmatic, we must understand our empathetic side and build our societies to incorporate it. Without one, the other collapses on its own insufficiency. The reason to read The Delusional Empaths is to ensure that your heart still bleeds, but that your brain also still works. Their arguments are emotionally powerful, and we should feel that their positions ought to be true, but also we must know that they are not, and as such cannot be entertained. We must ensure our empathy hasn't abandoned us, that our bleeding hearts hasn't hardened into cold steel. So many of us that begin our political and philosophical journey oozing with empathy just to abandon it altogether after becoming disenfranchised with human nature, let this occur. The truth is that we cannot effectively lead and protect if we do not feel for those around us, if we do not wish that the chilling horrors built into the DNA of our species were imagined or eradicable. But we must know what is true and act within the confines of humanity's flaws if we aim to empower our empathetic urges, to manifest emotion into constructive action. This is why we must feel the pain of the delusional empaths, yet endure it and resist the comforting lies they offer. For we can never address this true and righteous pain, endeavoring to resolve it, unless we acknowledge what is true. We must confront our inner nature and admit the irrefutable truths regarding biological inequality, the tendency towards callousness, universal avarice when given opportunity, and the unwavering desire to feel pride for ourselves, our achievements, and for those we align with. In larger work, as I mentioned, The Stone Wall, I will detail some of these delusional empaths: Michael Sandel, Peter Singer, and John Rawls. And then there are the Callous Pragmatists. We do not read the Callous Pragmatists to feel comforted, no. Their purpose serves the antithesis. Where the delusional empath tugs at our heartstrings, yet lacks intellectual honesty, or perhaps even a basic understanding of our reality's truths, the callous pragmatist diagnoses what ails us with startling precision, ripping through our comforting delusions like a barbed arrow. Too often their arrow is poisoned, and the thinkers propose solutions that are not only ill-advised, but inhumane. For many, After accurately diagnosing humanity and the innate flaws that govern our actions, a cold resolve forms. It is one built upon denying the very things that make us human, that bring us joy, solutions that often don't just approach but transcend into psychopathy. This is why we must understand the anger of the callous pragmatist and confront their truths. We must feel their pain but shed their cold rage. We must acknowledge their observations and dismiss their solutions. In fact, we must actively work to tear down their solutions, to build new ones that recognize the worst of our nature while preserving what makes us who we are. Solutions that work towards what ought to be in full awareness of what is. In the larger work, again, The Stone Wall, I discuss a few of these callous pragmatists: Hans Hermann Hoppe, Garrett Hardin, and Curtis Yarvin.